For years, Aretha Franklin was the queen of soul, graceful, powerful, and private. But behind the music and the crown was a grudge so deep, even her closest friends couldn't believe it. She didn't just dislike him, she truly hated him. And now, the shocking story behind their feud is finally coming to light. Who was the man who got under Aretha's skin like no one else? What did he do that she could never forgive? The truth will change how you see both of them forever. Aretha Franklin's story didn't start on a big stage or in a fancy studio. It began in a church in Detroit, where voices rose like thunder every Sunday, and the air smelled like perfume, sweat, and hallelujah. That church, New Bethel Baptist, was more than just a building. It was her father's kingdom. Reverend C.L. Franklin was powerful, magnetic, and already a star in his own right. People called him the man with the $1,000,000 voice, and he preached sermons that were recorded and sold like hit records. His words could make grown men cry. To the outside world, he was a man of God. But behind closed doors, things weren't so holy. Aretha grew up watching her father command crowds by day and throw loud, smoky parties by night. His house was filled with gospel stars, politicians, and laughter. But it was also filled with secrets. As a little girl, she saw things most kids never should. She loved her father, but she feared him too. He had a temper, and his approval could disappear in a second. He didn't just raise her. He managed her, molded her, controlled her. By the time she was 11, he was taking her on the road with his traveling gospel show. People were amazed by her voice, a voice too deep and powerful for someone so young. But off stage, she was just a quiet girl expected to obey. Her dad made all the decisions. What she sang, where she sang, who she worked with, and how much she got paid. And she didn't really have a choice. As she got older, the spotlight got bigger, but his shadow was always right there. When she signed with Columbia Records, he told them, "You don't just get Aretha, you get me." And that was the truth. Every dollar, every deal, every move went through him. Aretha once said that her father gave her both the gift and the burden of her voice. That's what it was. A blessing, but also a cage. She learned early that love didn't always come without strings. In her world, love could mean control. It could mean sacrifice. And before any man ever hurt her, it was her father who taught her what it meant to feel trapped by someone who claimed to love you. That was the first wound, the one that stayed with her long after the applause faded. When Aretha Franklin stepped on stage, she looked untouchable, strong, graceful, with a voice that could stop time. People saw a queen. But what they didn't see was the weight she carried inside. Behind every powerful note she sang, there was pain. And some of the deepest wounds came from the men in her life, the ones who were supposed to love her, protect her, and help her grow. Instead, they controlled her, hurt her, and in some cases, nearly broke her. Her first great heartbreak didn't come from a stranger. It came from the man she married. Aretha was just 19 years old when she met Ted White. He was nearly 10 years older, charming, good-looking, and full of confidence. People close to her warned her to stay away. They said he was trouble, that he had a slick mouth and a dark side. But Aretha was young, hungry for freedom, and tired of living under her father's rules. Ted looked like a way out. At first, it seemed like a love story. He dressed sharp, talked smooth, and knew how to make her feel like a woman. But things changed fast. He didn't just become her husband, he became her manager. That meant he controlled not just her heart, but her career. He decided what she sang, where she performed, what she wore, who she could speak to, and even what she said in interviews. On the outside, it looked like he was guiding her career. In reality, he was tightening the grip around her life. People in the studio started noticing things. She'd come in with long sleeves, covering up bruises. She'd smile politely, but her eyes seemed distant, like she was somewhere else. Musicians saw the way Ted watched her, the way his mood shifted when she laughed with other men. One missed note, one late phone call, one joke he didn't like, any of it could set him off. Aretha was becoming more famous, more loved, but inside her own marriage, she felt like a prisoner. The breaking point came in 1968. Aretha had just performed in Montgomery, Alabama for a civil rights benefit. She was using her voice not just to entertain, but to fight for justice. It should have been a proud moment. But 2 weeks later, in Augusta, Georgia, something terrible happened. After a concert backstage, Ted accused her of flirting with a musician. He had been drinking. The argument got louder, and then, in front of the band and crew, he hit her. One violent blow. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just froze. That night, she packed her bag silently and flew back to Detroit alone. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, but something inside her had changed. She made a promise to herself, never again. Their marriage limped on a little longer, like many abusive relationships do. He begged, he apologized, he made promises, but the damage was already done. By 1969, she filed for divorce. In public, she gave no drama, just said, it wasn't right. But behind closed doors, she told friends she finally understood what love should never feel like. Years later, when people tried to ask her about Ted, she would shut down. Her face would harden. She never said his name in public again. In one rare interview, when asked about her first husband, she said only, he's someone I learned from, and that's all I'll say. She didn't want pity. She wanted power back. She wanted silence to speak for her, but Ted wasn't the only man who left a scar. In the 1970s, as soul music was rising fast, another figure became a quiet storm in her life. James Brown. To the world, they were royalty, the queen of soul and the godfather of funk. On stage, they burned with the same fire, but off stage, it was all competition and tension. James didn't like to share the spotlight. He wanted to be the only one worshipped. Their rivalry started at the Apollo Theater in 1968. Both were scheduled to perform at a benefit for Martin Luther King Jr. Aretha had rehearsed all day. James showed up hours late and demanded to close the show. He got his way. When Aretha finally sang, the crowd was already tired. She gave it her all, but it was clear he had stolen the moment. And that was just the beginning. For years, they clashed silently. When Aretha was invited to sing at the White House, James called his team the next day and got himself invited too. If she had a hit, he wanted one bigger. If she was on a magazine cover, he wanted the next one. In 1973, their feud boiled over at the Soul Train Awards. Backstage, James, drunk and loud, mocked her performance in front of other artists. It nearly became physical. Security had to step in. From that day on, they avoided each other at events. They had separate dressing rooms, separate entrances. He bragged that she feared him. She said nothing, but made sure they never stood in the same room again. Even after his death in 2006, she didn't go to the funeral. She sent flowers. The card read only, "Peace at last." She didn't forgive him. She simply outlasted him. Then came a different kind of pain, quieter, but just as deep. In the 1980s, her career needed a spark. The music industry was changing. Her label brought in a young producer named Luther Vandross. He was talented, passionate, and full of ideas. At first, their partnership looked like magic. Their first song together, "Jump to It," was a hit. But the truth behind the studio doors was darker. Luther wanted control. He wanted perfection. He treated Aretha like a student, not a queen. He'd stop takes, demand retakes, and criticize her choices. One night, he told her to re-record a whole verse, and she walked out of the studio. When she came back hours later, she sang the line, "cold and sharp." That was the take they used. The hit was born, but so was the fracture. When magazines started praising Luther as the man who saved the Queen of Soul, something broke inside Aretha. She felt humiliated, forgotten, like a guest in her own legend. The next album they did together was a disaster. Fights, shouting, silence. She refused to do joint interviews. He stopped calling. Their connection died, and it never came back. Years later, when Luther had a stroke, she sent flowers, but no message. When he died, she said only, "I wish him peace." She wasn't angry anymore. She was just done. The real wound wasn't what he said, it was what he took. He didn't hurt her body. He hurt her pride. He touched the one thing she believed was sacred, her voice. All three of these men, Ted, James, and Luther, played different roles in her life. One was a husband who tried to own her. One was a rival who tried to outshine her. One was a partner who made her feel small. None of them understood what it meant to love a woman like Aretha Franklin, a woman who had already survived a father who preached love but ruled with fear, a woman who had given everything to music and still had to fight for her place in it. The personal was never just personal for Aretha. Every heartbreak bled into her songs. Every silence she kept became another verse. She didn't cry in public. She didn't tell her story in interviews. She told it in sound. When she sang about respect, freedom, and heartache, it wasn't just performance. It was survival. She didn't need revenge. She had something better. She had the stage. Aretha Franklin was used to being hurt by men. She had scars from lovers, managers, even her father, but some of the deepest cuts in her life didn't come from men at all. They came from women she once considered sisters. These weren't private betrayals whispered behind closed doors. These were the kind that happened with the cameras rolling, the kind that got printed in magazines and played on the evening news. And for someone like Aretha, who guarded her pride like a fortress, those betrayals were the hardest to forgive. One of the most painful came from someone who had once shared the gospel stage with her, Dionne Warwick. They had both grown up in the church, both learned how to sing before they could barely walk, and had known each other for decades. They had sung at the same events, laughed in dressing rooms, prayed together before shows. There was a bond there, or so Aretha thought. Then came Whitney Houston's funeral in 2012. Aretha was supposed to sing, but she had to cancel at the last moment due to health issues, bad leg spasms that made it nearly impossible for her to stand, let alone perform. The cancellation was real, but it happened so close to the service that people were already whispering. And then Dionne made it worse. She stood at the podium, looked out over the grieving crowd, and said something like, "Aretha's not here, but she's with us in spirit. Whitney's godmother." It sounded harmless to most people, a kind comment during a sad moment, but to Aretha, it was like being slapped in the face on national television. Not only had she never been Whitney's godmother, but the line made it sound like she had used her illness as an excuse to skip the funeral. And Aretha hated nothing more than being misunderstood, especially in front of the world. Still, she didn't say anything right away. She stayed quiet for 5 long years. Then in 2017, everything came boiling to the surface. Aretha was 75, her body was failing, her performances fewer and farther between. But her pride? Still sharp as ever. One morning, the Associated Press received a 5-page typed letter signed by Aretha herself. In it, she accused Dionne Warwick of lying, publicly, deliberately, and cruelly. She wrote, "Dionne knows exactly what she did. She lied on me." That line exploded through the entertainment world. Headlines lit up with the news. Aretha Franklin slams Dionne Warwick in shocking statement. Reporters scrambled for Dionne's response. She just laughed and said she had no time for nonsense. That laugh, light and dismissive, cut Aretha deeper than the original comment. It wasn't just about Whitney anymore. It was about disrespect. And for Aretha, disrespect was a kind of blasphemy. You see, Dionne wasn't just another singer. She was a part of the same gospel bloodline that Aretha came from. She had sung at Aretha's father's church. They had sat in the same pews, sung the same hymns, shared the same roots. For someone like Aretha, those connections meant something. That kind of history couldn't be faked. So when Dionne stood on that stage and, in Aretha's eyes, twisted the truth, she wasn't just hurting a colleague. She was wounding the spirit of something sacred. Aretha never forgave her. People tried to brush it off as diva drama, but for Aretha, it was much more serious. Her team released another short note after Dionne's laugh, saying the matter was not up for debate. She didn't want an apology. She didn't want to make peace. She wanted the truth to stand. Behind the scenes, her assistant said she would walk the halls of her home in Detroit late at night, muttering pieces of that letter to herself, rewriting it in her head even after it had been sent. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correction, about making sure her name stayed clean. For a woman who sang about respect her whole life, reputation wasn't just important. It was everything. And it wasn't just Dionne. There was another woman who broke something in her. Her old producer, Clive Davis, who wasn't a woman by gender, but played a role in a different kind of emotional betrayal, reducing her legacy to marketing numbers. Under his direction, she had experienced one of the most successful comebacks of her career. But over time, she began to feel more like a product than a person. They gave her fancy titles like America's Lady of Soul, but to her, it felt like a downgrade. She was the queen. Always had been. She smiled for cameras, shook hands at events, but the trust was gone. When Clive released a book years later describing her as temperamental and saying he had to coax greatness out of her, it felt like a knife to the back. Again, the story of a powerful woman was being retold through a man's lens, as if her brilliance came only when someone else pulled it out of her. She didn't fight back in interviews. She didn't curse him out in public. But those closest to her said she never forgot it. That book, those words, they went straight on to her mental list, the one she kept like a prayer book, a list of every betrayal, every slight, every name she chose never to say out loud again. In her final years, her circle got smaller. She stopped answering calls. She barely left her mansion, but she never lost track of who had crossed her. She could sing about love, mercy, and forgiveness all day long. But when it came to people who disrespected her in public, who changed the story of who she was, there was no second chance. And yet, she didn't need revenge. She didn't need to fight back loudly. She just outlived them all. That was her way. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just closed the door. And once Aretha Franklin closed the door on you, it never opened again. At her funeral in 2018, Dionne Warwick sat quietly in the third row. She didn't speak. She didn't sing. Aretha's voice filled the room instead, playing from recordings, rising like smoke through the church. It was Aretha's goodbye, on her own terms, in her own voice. That day, even in death, she had the final word. Because for the Queen of Soul, silence wasn't weakness. It was power. She had spent her entire life building a legacy, and anyone who tried to write her story for her, anyone who twisted the truth in front of the world, they weren't just crossing Aretha Franklin. They were crossing a line they could never return from. When Aretha Franklin passed away on August 16, 2018, the world stopped to mourn. News anchors called her a legend. Fans gathered outside churches and record stores. Her songs played everywhere, from car radios to concert halls. The Queen of Soul was gone, and people grieved like they'd lost a piece of themselves. But for those who had truly known her, not just her music, but the woman, her death wasn't just the end of a life. It was the closing of a vault filled with secrets, grudges, and the quiet kind of pain that never made it into the spotlight. Aretha wasn't the kind of person who forgave easily. That's not because she was bitter, it's because she believed that forgiveness wasn't free. You had to earn it. And if someone hurt her, especially in public, they rarely got another chance. She carried every betrayal with her. Here, not loudly, not dramatically, but carefully. Like a list in her mind she checked every so often, just to remind herself who she could trust and who she couldn't. After she died, her family discovered 3 handwritten wills tucked away in random places, under couch cushions, in notebooks. Each one had detailed instructions about her estate, her money, her sons. But you know what was missing? The names of the people who had once been closest to her, and then hurt her. Her ex-husband Ted White wasn't there. Neither was Luther Vandross. Not Dionne Warwick, not Clive Davis. No mention, not even in passing. Even in death, Aretha was editing her story. She chose who would be remembered and who wouldn't. That was her power, not just the way she sang, but the way she controlled her life, her image, her truth. For her, silence wasn't just about peace. It was about protection, because the world had tried so many times to own her voice, rewrite her story, or take credit for her success, and she refused to let that happen. People close to her would say she was warm, generous, even funny. She could feed a stranger without blinking, give to a church, help a young singer with no name. But if you crossed her, if you disrespected her, that was it. The door closed. She once told a friend, "Sin is between you and God, but disrespect, that's between you and me." To her, those were 2 very different things. In her last years, her world got smaller, her health was failing, and her energy was limited. But she still kept control over everything. She chose her wardrobe, she chose her songs, she chose her schedule. No one else told her what to do. Even when she could barely walk, she wouldn't let anyone adjust her set list without asking her first. Control wasn't just a habit, it was her last form of safety. There was a kind of loneliness in all of it. As her circle shrank, she trusted fewer and fewer people. Phone calls were shorter, visits were rare. But the few who stayed knew the truth. She didn't want pity. She didn't want someone to carry her pain for her. She had already learned how to carry it alone. A few months before she died, someone recorded her last rehearsal at Detroit's Music Hall. The audio is haunting. Her voice was weaker than it had been, but still beautiful, still hers. She stopped mid-song again and again, repeating the same phrase until it felt perfect. It wasn't about the audience. It wasn't about the applause. It was about her, about getting it right one last time. That recording wasn't just music. It was a woman still fighting for mastery, still trying to command every note, still refusing to let go. That's the part of her story people sometimes miss. Aretha didn't build her legacy only through talent. She built it through fire, through the things she survived, every heartbreak, every stolen moment, every time someone tried to silence her. She took all of it and turned it into music. Her voice didn't just rise, it climbed, it fought, it bled. And that's why it moved people the way it did, because it came from a place no spotlight could reach. She wasn't just respected, she was feared. Politicians wanted her to sing at their rallies, presidents wanted her voice at their inaugurations, fellow musicians bowed to her. But underneath that respect was a warning. You could love Aretha Franklin, but don't ever try to cross her, don't lie to her, don't erase her. Because she would remember, and she would make sure you were forgotten. She didn't believe in letting go easily, because in her eyes, letting go often meant giving away power, and power was the one thing she had to fight for her whole life. As a young girl under her father's rule, as a wife in an abusive marriage, as a black woman in a white male-led industry, every inch of power she had, she earned, and she never surrendered it. Not to labels, not to lovers, not even to time. In 2020, when her handwritten will was finally read aloud in a Michigan courtroom, one line stood out more than anything else. She had written, "Everything I am is the result of everything I survived." That was her truth. That was her legacy. Some people say holding on to anger can destroy a person. Maybe for some, that's true. But for Aretha Franklin, it was armor. It kept her safe in a world that kept trying to tear her down. It gave her the strength to walk away from those who hurt her and the clarity to know who she was, without needing approval from anyone else. She didn't sing just to be heard. She sang to survive. Every note was part of her story. Every lyric held a piece of the pain she refused to hide, and in the end, she turned that pain into something beautiful, into something unforgettable. Aretha Franklin didn't forgive everyone. She didn't try to, but she did something even harder. She outlasted them. She turned silence into power, pain into gold. And that, more than anything, is what made her a queen.